fellow BIPOCs, POCs, women, LGBTQs, gender nonconforming, anyone who experiences disproportionate inequity. And this message would be for anyone in those groups that would consider themselves marginalized by society. The identities that we've constructed around ourselves in response to very real historical and structural racism, homophobia, misogyny, transphobia. But the identities we've developed in response to those things are dehumanizing. Yes, dehumanizing. If you're able to receive this message, then I'll tell you right now, you're an outlier for sure. But it's certainly something that many of us need to hear to provide proper context to inequity from an anthropological standpoint, not an identity standpoint. Granted, identity is important. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves that identity is such a small feature of human existence. There's identity and then there's humanity. Which is to say, you're just having a human experience. No matter what your circumstances, no matter what group you belong to, no matter what trauma you're sustaining, you're just having a human experience. From a human standpoint, there's nothing different about what you're going through. I'll give you a quick example. With regard to race, modern Homo sapiens have been on the planet for roughly 300,000 years. Race was only invented about 5 centuries ago, give or take. So human beings have been aware of race for about 0.16% of its existence. 99.98% of humanity, just chronologically speaking, never even heard of race. Most humans ever to exist live their whole lives completely oblivious to their race. Yet plenty of people in that span have been sacrificed, decapitated, taken advantage of, mercilessly exploited, regarded as mere animals, exposed to unspeakable trauma, mostly by people who look exactly like them. So this kind of inhumanity experienced by human beings is deeply human, irrespective of identity. It's such a late arrival. You almost want to say it's throwaway. It's certainly a product of modernity. It's a superficiality that's overly regarded by both oppressor and the oppressed. It's hypermodern, but nonsensical. It's like if Coca-Cola were to exploit Pepsi and subject Pepsi to structural inequities and Pepsi saying, "Pepsi is my identity. I'm proud of being Pepsi. Coca-Cola treats me as a second-class citizen. But I still wear my Pepsi colors proudly." That's the moment we're living in with respect to identity. That's not to say it'll always be that way. Identity in a group sense may certainly go away at some point. It certainly hasn't been here very long. It's just a blip in the timeline of human existence. But somehow it's everything to us. But it certainly can go away at some point. But inequity will not. It'll always be here. Let's make our peace with that. You can rail against it, but you don't have to be so triggered by it. You should have the same emotional relationship to it as you do heart disease, Alzheimer's, cancer, stroke, diabetes, ischemic heart attack, kidney failure, vehicular deaths. The first time we experience vehicular deaths as a species, some people were triggered by automobile drivers, by reckless drivers, by drivers under the influence, malicious drivers. We developed seat belts and airbags, backup cameras. Some people were triggered by drivers. But it's kind of useless. It just takes away from the quality of life of the person that's triggered. Not the bad drivers. Fast forward 100 years later and we still have vehicular deaths. And they're awful. But you don't have to let it take away from your quality of life. You just continue to try find ways to mitigate it and continue on with your human experience. You don't have to develop your whole identity in relation to it. Or be totally consumed in your life by vehicular deaths. And And incidentally, they happen far more often to people than anything race-related or related to gender, sexual orientation. Like I said, identity is a tiny aspect of what it means to be human. There's something fundamental about human beings of any race or ethnicity or anything that we have to get out the way before we can even wrap our minds around inequity and things like that. So here it goes. Human beings aren't subjects first. We're not even subjects foremost. Which is to say, the most essential part of who we are as humans is not our subjective experience. It's not this glorious human experience we're having. That's not the most essential part of us. Sad to say, Homo sapiens are part subject, part object. We are part conscience, part tool. That's our physiological reality. I mean, we have opposable thumbs. We are literally part tool, part object. But we're also subjects because we have consciousness. A human being is at the intersection of subject and object. There's no getting around that. To be at the nexus of those two things is kind of the sweet spot of being human. In a Venn diagram between subject and object, that mesh point is where you become human. Like we have to be both. If you're never objectified, you're not quite human. Paradoxically, you're just not. We're partly objects. That's any human being. To be objectified is an essential part of being human. To be purely a subject is not even human. That's an apparition. That's a phantom. It's completely meaningless to only be a subject. In fact, it's pointless. It's literally pointless. Human consciousness evolved as a function. As just a function. So consciousness itself is merely a tool. You're only conscious to be of use to your body. It evolved literally as a tool for our body. Our bodies developed consciousness merely to be more efficient, so that it wouldn't have to engage in repetitive behaviors in order to adapt to environments. So it could adapt to environments more rapidly by virtue of being aware of its own actions. So subjectivity itself is an object. Consciousness itself is just a tool. It's a piece of technology, that's all. It's a tool utilized by an aggregate of cellular organisms that genetically express themselves as a phenotypical human being. Consciousness isn't the thing itself when it comes to being human. It's not the thing that makes us human. It's not. Someone in a persistent vegetative state, someone who is only alive autonomically, is no less a human than anyone else. Human consciousness, this thing that we're so enamored with and feel so mystical about, it's only a tool. That's all it is. It would be completely unnecessary to have consciousness without a body. Its only use is to move a body in an efficient manner in a global workspace, in a complex global workspace. Complexity is the thing that brings about consciousness. It comes merely as a response to complexity. Consciousness is not the cause of things, it's an effect. It's not an action. It's a reaction. There would have been no need for it without complexity. It's there just to manage complexity. That's the only point of it. It's the only reason we have consciousness in the first place. And it's there to manage complexity on the ground. Which is to say, in relation to matter. So these genetic matrices that make up a human organism are merely contending with complex matter in an attempt to transcribe itself, to reproduce itself genetically. And consciousness is merely there to assist that. It's an assistant. It's not the boss. And it's very specific. All of these material complexities had to be thrown at an organism in a very specific way in a very specific moment in time with respect to a very specific primate. Consciousness is a primate's tool. It's a piece of tech. It's a tool, like that stone that sea otters use. It's just utilized by a particular species of primate. Only because the space that this particular primate occupies is so complex. And at this point in the history of Homo sapiens, specifically, the primary source of all of that complexity is social. There are specific behaviors that Homo sapiens engage in currently that require consciousness for whatever reason. And those behaviors are overwhelmingly social. Like, don't interact with an infant for a year or two, just give it nutrients and see how much its brain develops. It will barely be hanging on to consciousness. And the little consciousness it'll have will only be there by virtue of its encoded DNA, its gene expression from its parent DNA. But it would barely be hanging on to it. But the more complex the interaction, the more relevant consciousness becomes. It's only there if there's a demand for it. Like we do all these highly logical things that have no direct relationship to social interaction, like complex math and technological development. But remove the social aspect of complexity and we'd lose those abilities very quickly. It was society that provided the pretext for general intelligence. Having to develop theories of mind and predict behavior. We just found that these newfound abilities could be applied to non-social things. But it required social complexity. Remove the complexity and consciousness will soon follow. Consciousness will become pointless. This is why things like Hinduism don't make sense. Not to go after Hinduism specifically, but reaching a state of pure nirvana or peace effectively ends consciousness. Error 404, it's like a computer program or artificial intelligence. Its only point is to solve problems, to handle complexity. Its sole reason for existence is just that. You solve all of the problems through nirvana or enlightenment, and nature would be like, what do I need consciousness for? I'm going to go ahead and eliminate it because it's literally wasting energy at this point. It's like being the last living organism on Earth, but for some pointless reason still maintaining a sophisticated home security system to detect potential dangers that aren't even there, because you've reached nirvana, of course. What's the point of even existing without problems? Human consciousness becomes pointless. It makes it a skeuomorph. It'll eventually fade away. Human consciousness is a function of conflict. It's not mystical at all. It is literally functional. It is there to problem solve. And not for itself either, for its body. It is literally being exploited by its own body. Your conscious self as a human being is meant for exploitation. I hate to put it so starkly. That is its sole reason for existence. It is just a tool. That's the reality of any human being. The whole point of consciousness is a lack of peace. The whole point of consciousness is potential upheaval, unpredictability, pattern recognition, problem solving, imbalances, inequities. It's the whole pretext for consciousness. Homo sapiens, which is to say wise human, a reference to the neocortex, which is where consciousness resides. It's literally how human beings are able to be self-aware of the stimuli they receive. But Homo sapiens as a species becomes irrelevant without inequity. Yet we lose our minds that inequity exists. It'll always be here. In fact, there's about 11 million or so bits of information that the human brain processes every second. But we're only consciously aware of about 40 or so bits of information per second. And the critical thing that makes a unit of information even worthy of conscious awareness is some potential threat to homeostasis within the environment, some real or perceived inequity in the environment. Otherwise, our brain would filter it out. We'd quite literally be unaware of it. It's kind of the point of why we experience anything. It's the only reason we experience anything. The only reason that you're kind of aware of things despite no momentary conflict is because there is a potential for it. It's a kind of low threat level vigilance. You know, you're just sitting there on the couch and you're kind of vaguely aware of yourself on the couch or yourself in the room, and there's a chair nearby and you can hear the hum of traffic in the distance or whatever. The only reasons you're conscious of any of that are potential threats to homeostasis, potential inequities. As long as we have consciousness, there will be inequities. If there ever comes a time when there are no more social inequities, Homo sapiens won't be there to witness it. And it won't be because we've evolved to some higher intelligence. It'll be because we've become banana slugs. Or bacteria. Because there would have been no more use for consciousness. The body that needs it is no longer in an environment that requires it. That's why, when nothing's going on, you zone out, you're less aware of things. The only thing that will maintain this great gift of consciousness that we possess, this movie we all get to watch, and that's just most of us. Some of us are clinically unconscious, but the only thing that will maintain human consciousness is inequity. Unfortunately. And people of color who experience inequity disproportionately. Congratulations, you're having a profound human experience. You are literally experiencing the very thing that makes you human. Don't let it destroy you. It's human. Like, subscribe, and support the Golden Ratio on Patreon found in the link below.